Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Maryland Democratic Party Burgers and Brews Gubernatorial Candidates Forum. I'm Yvette Lewis. I'm the chair of the Maryland Democratic Party, and we are so happy to be here tonight in beautiful Frederick, Maryland. When we started this, we said we wanted to move these forums all around the state, and this is our second one, and we are delighted to be here. Thank you so much to Attaboy Barrel House for hosting and sponsoring us, and thank you to our additional sponsors, GS Proctor and Associates, Velocity Capital, Jim and Tracy Ratchiff, and the coordinated sponsorship of County Executive Jan Gardner and council members Keegan Ayer, Donald, Fitzwater, and Hagan. Thank you all so much. We are very grateful. I would also like to welcome Mayor Michael O'Connor, who is here this evening, our Central Committee members from Frederick, elected officials, candidates, all of you watching on Facebook Live, and everyone here in person. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We will be holding several of these forums around the state to showcase rural areas of Maryland. The forums will culminate in the last event, Burgers and Brews, the final pitch. This is where candidates will have the opportunity to make their final pitch at a baseball field just before the Maryland primary. And I'm hoping that all of you will be able to join us for that. We will have more about the date once we know exactly the logistics and as far as the primary is concerned, because I think all of you heard today that the date has been changed. So we will update the date to make sure that you all know exactly when that is. Now, I would like to introduce Carly Ogden, who's the co-owner of Attaboy Beer. This incredible space. Isn't this a fabulous space to do an event? Give her a big hand.
Hi there. Hi. I'm Carly Ogden. I'm the owner of Attaboy Beer and Attaboy Barrel House with my husband. Instead of pitching Attaboy Beer first, I'd like to say thank you guys for your representation here today and throughout your careers. I would you like to give a little sound bite of love to Frederick? My people always ask us, how did you end up here? My husband and I moved here from San Francisco to be near family. And we were looking for a space in Maryland to start a business. And we just called the Office of Economic Development here, and they returned our phone call. And so we got in our car and came to this place that we had never been. And we walked on the creek, and it just opened on this side. Before us, there was McCutcheon's and this lovely built-out creek with no one. And we walked around the park, and we were like, all right, let's spend $500,000 here. Not ours, SBA loan, but, you know. And I was pregnant at the time, so lots of this must have nice schools and that kind of stuff. So we love Frederick, and throughout the pandemic, they've supported us. We applied for every single PPP, everything that was available, and we got a good deal of it. And this space would not be here without that. We opened this in 2019 and shut it in February of 2020. So for us, we understand the value of representation and government and public schools, and we do appreciate, what you guys have to offer. So anyway, yay, bye.
Thank you so much, Carly. And now I would like to introduce someone who is a friend of all of ours. She's a fantastic county executive. Please join me in welcoming County Executive Jan Gardner.
Thank you, Yvette, and welcome to Frederick County. Frederick County is home of the clustered spires. We have scenic byways from the Catoctin Mountains to Sugarloaf Mountain, going over covered bridges, and we're known for our craft beverages, which you can sample here this evening. Our motto in Frederick County is Rich History, Bright Future, recognizing and evaluating our authentically historic downtown run by our mayor, Michael O'Connor, and the aldermen of the city of Frederick, and our agricultural heritage. And we embrace our future at the same time with our opportunities in life sciences and in high tech. And I'm really optimistic that someday the cure for cancer is going to be found right here in Frederick County. Frederick County residents are certainly excited to hear from our gubernatorial candidates, and we feel incredibly blessed to have such a well-qualified experienced group of candidates for governor. Certainly, you bring local government experience, which I value. You're a former attorney general, former secretary of education, a secretary of labor, bringing business experience, nonprofit experience, really a wealth of experience within the group that is here tonight. So I appreciate that we have shared values of fairness and justice, a value for keeping the promise of public education, which is fundamentally important to our democracy, and for ensuring a thriving economy that lifts everyone and supports everyone. So thank you for running for governor. Thank you for being here. And I hope to see you back here in Frederick County again. With that, on with the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, County Executive Gardner. Now it is my privilege to introduce our moderator, Danielle Gaines. Danielle is the editor of Maryland Matters, but covered government and politics for Maryland Matters for 2 years before moving into an editing position. Previously, she spent 6 years at the Frederick News Post as the paper's principal government and politics reporter. So she's home. Thank you, Danielle, and I'll turn it over to you now. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I just have to add to the Frederick Love Fest before we get started. Frederick is amazing. I left part of my heart here. I love coming back here. The ride up 270 was clogged, so I went on the back roads. It was a trip down memory lane, and I'm just so happy. I'm happy to be here now for Maryland Matters and to introduce you to all these candidates. Tonight, we're going to hear some of their thoughts on transportation issues. Each candidate is going to have 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer the moderated questions. We have timekeepers in the crowd, so please pay attention. And we're going to try to respect everyone's time and get through a lot of questions. For the audience Q&A, the candidates will have 1 minute each. Now I'd like to briefly introduce each of the candidates on the panel tonight. So at the end, we have Mr. John Barron, a former Clinton administration official. Then we have Mr. Doug Gansler, former Maryland Attorney General. Ashwani Jain, a former Obama administration official. John King, former U.S. Education Secretary. Laura Newman, former Anne Arundel County executive. And Dr. Jerome Siegel, an author and research scholar. Dr. Jerome Siegel. I even wrote it right, and then I did it wrong. I'm sorry. So we're going to go ahead. Candidates will have an opportunity for closing statements. So we're going to go ahead and skip openings, and I'm just going to go right into the questions with you guys. Each candidate will have the opportunity to answer one question first, and then the next person will go in alphabetical order. So our first question will start with Mr. Barron, then to Mr. Gansler, Mr. Jain, and on down the line. To kick things off, Mr. Barron. The Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority could face a $500 million annual operating deficit starting in July 2023 due to changed ridership patterns from the pandemic. Do you favor increased Maryland subsidies for Metro if they're matched by Virginia and DC to cover that gap? Or should Metro reduce services and costs to reflect the lower ridership levels in their budget?
Thank you, Danielle. So I'm a strong believer in mass transit and a user of mass transit. I have ridden the bus myself to work for 25 years, and I can tell you all the virtues of doing that and the drawbacks. I'm a user of all kinds of public transit. I was very pleased to see that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill there was substantial funding for WMATA and to close some of the problems. Now, we don't know. I think the issue is we don't know what the situation is going to be in terms of revenues and in terms of expenses. Will ridership come back now that the pandemic hopefully is waning, and therefore will revenues increase? So I think we should wait and see to see what happens. Right now, the system is solvent. The federal money is there. There may be a need for additional money from Virginia and from Maryland. And I would, we've proposed 3%. We're putting in 3% increases each year. Whether that needs to be raised, I would look at it depending on the circumstances a few years from now when it comes up.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler?
Thank you, and thank you for having this forum. And I want to thank Yvette Lewis and the Democratic Party for doing this, and particularly being in Western Maryland. And welcome everybody here to one of the 5 counties of Western Maryland. Democrats do need to speak to Western Maryland. I know most of you in the audience, but I would like to point out Jan Gardner, who's done just a phenomenal job as a county executive here. She's the greatest county executive ever in Frederick. I know that's a little bit of a stacked statement, but I think she will be going forward as well. And to Mayor O'Connor for what you've done, carrying on the legacy of Ron Young, who I'm so pleased to have his endorsement here in Frederick. And the mayor's done a phenomenal job here in Frederick as well. In terms of WMATA, it's important to have someone that's experienced to be governor and someone who's worked with local governments before. I was been in government for 23 years, mostly as a prosecutor, as an assistant United States attorney, as the state's attorney in Montgomery County, which used to be part of Frederick, a suburb of Frederick, and as your attorney general. And working with Virginia and D.C. to make sure we have proper funding for WMATA is going to be absolutely essential going forward. We will get the revenues back if it's run well and is properly funded. We also, of course, and I hope we talk about it tonight, the subway ends at Shady Grove, and we need to make sure that we have a connection from Shady Grove to Frederick. We need to have the MARC trains go more regularly, not just 3 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon going back, but we need to have those regularly and to extend from Shady Grove to here, be it monorail or light rail.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for this opportunity. So the shortest answer that I can give, and then I'll expand a little bit, is we need to make sure that public transit is fully accessible for every resident in our state. It not only helps our economy, it's going to help our climate. We need to extend certain services and fully fund those services to all parts of the state, especially in Western Maryland, where there's not enough public transit already available. One part of our Maryland Now plan, which you can go to janeforgovernor.com to hold me accountable and look at those details, is actually to guarantee free public transit for every resident of Maryland who currently has public transit available. It's fully paid for. Anything that's covered under MTA would be available. And this, again, is going to help seniors get around. It's going to help those with disabilities get around, those from low-income neighborhoods, and also help businesses reach their customers easier and employees get to and from work. So it is looking at the issue comprehensively, I think, is what we need to do, and making sure that we have the funds for it, making sure we prioritize mass transit, and also make sure that we're including residents who are going to be impacted by those policies in those decisions as well from day one.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Thanks so much, and grateful for the opportunity to be here in Frederick, and grateful to the party for hosting this conversation about such an important issue. Look, of course, we need to work with Virginia and D.C. to make sure that there are the resources there to keep WMATA whole. The key to getting riders back will be maintaining affordability and reliability. And so that must happen. But we need to be more ambitious than that. We need to see that public transit is critical to equity. It's critical to economic development. It's critical to climate action. And so we've got to, in addition to sustaining WMATA, we've got to build the Southern Maryland Light Rail project. We've got to extend the MARC West. We've got to make sure that there are more frequent MARC trains. We've got to build the Red Line in Baltimore City. We've got to make sure that we finish the Purple Line. All of those investments in public transportation are going to help us build the more just and more prosperous future that we need in the state. And as we do those things, we can tap into the large surplus that we have, the bipartisan infrastructure funding, as well as hopefully additional federal funding that should be coming to try to tackle the consequences of climate change.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
Good evening. Thank you for having us here this evening. I'm thrilled to be in Frederick, and I appreciate that you all came out tonight to hear a little bit more from the candidates. The answer to this question for me is very simple. First of all, I've had the honor of serving in public office as county executive. I run an economic development agency, but most of my career was in the private sector. I was a tech entrepreneur, and we have a saying about raising venture capital in the private sector, and that is that people participate pro rata. Pro rata means that you pay or participate according to how you've already invested, or in this case, how it serves the community. I believe that Washington, D.C., and by the way, the federal government, who is probably one of the bigger users of mass transit, should pay their pro rata share. And it shouldn't be just the district, it should be the federal government as well. And to the extent that Maryland riders and Virginia riders use mass transit, they should pay their pro rata share. That seems fair, it seems equitable, and at the end of the day, mass transit needs to be available to everyone. I grew up on mass transit. We often didn't have a car that worked in our family, and until we make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get to libraries, to schools, and to work, then we haven't really provided a level playing field for everyone in our community. It is one of the areas where government can make the biggest impact and where we must have investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel?
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Jerome Siegel. I'm running as a bread and roses socialist. Nobody knows what that is, and I'm going to try to explain that tonight. But one of the things that's clear to me is that I disagree with everybody else who's running on basics, such as what is an economy for at this level of economic development? What do we mean by progress? What do we mean by a good job? What's the relationship of the schooling system to the job system? So I'm by training a philosopher. I also have a degree in public policy, worked in government for many years. But nonetheless, what I have to say is sometimes complex, sometimes it's subtle. It can't be done in 60 seconds, and it can't be done in 90 seconds. So I'm going to be constantly bumping up against the rules. But I want to start with something very concrete right now. Transportation is central to what we're about here. And our goal for the transportation sector is very concrete. Transportation right now takes up roughly 20% of household expenditures, 20% of time. We want to knock that down to 5%. That 15% translates into 15% of labor time, which is 3/4 of a day, okay? We save 3/4 of a day. You can go home at 10 o'clock on Friday.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. On our next question, we'll start with Attorney General Gansler. On the project to add toll lanes to I-495 and I-270, if elected, would you continue Governor Hogan's plans to build a new American Legion bridge over the Potomac and widen parts of the Beltway and I-270 with toll lanes financed by a private company? Or would you favor Maryland taking over this project? If you would prefer the state to take over, how would you accomplish that?
Yeah, the American Legion Bridge 270 project is one phase of the original 3 phases. So I think it's great that phase 2 and 3 have been scrapped for now, running through houses in Montgomery and Prince George's County. The need to make sure people from Frederick can get to Washington, I mentioned, or the D.C. suburbs. I mentioned earlier how we need to get, right now the MARC train goes up here 3 times a day, goes back 3 times a day. In the short term, we need to expand the MARC train. We do need to fix the American Legion Bridge. I don't think anyone wants to play hot potato and be the person driving over it when it falls through. I do think we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place in Maryland because the private sector is moving toward electric vehicles, and we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place to support that, so that if and when 270 is completed and is expanded, the cars on that are electric vehicles and not polluting vehicles. We need to make sure right now the procurement system under this administration needs some grown-ups. And as we saw from the Purple Line, the overtures on expenses there and the time delay there, we're seeing on the 270 expansion, and it's going to make that what happened with Purple Line look moderate. And so we need to expand it. We should not let the state take over. It should be a P3 because we need the money for the other projects that we'll be talking about tonight, but we do need to make sure it's done in an environmentally friendly way and an efficient, effective way.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
I am deeply opposed to adding toll lanes to I-270, to adding more lanes. Studies have shown time and time again that when you add more roads, it doesn't really do much to reduce traffic in the long term because demand is only going to be increased. So that's where I support this comprehensive infrastructure plan where you have more designated bus lanes, designated HOV lanes, making sure we have smart growth and mixed-use development. So we're not just focused on single-family housing, but multifamily housing, especially where areas where there's already transit available. Making sure that we have free public transit as part of my Maryland Now plan that I mentioned earlier. Making sure that we're investing in MARC trains so we have all-day services. Making sure that We're doing environmental impact studies as well for any piece of legislation that could have an impact on our environment or the infrastructure, so we don't have to pick up these pieces later. And then a final big piece of this is accountability and transparency. Making sure whenever we do any of our contracts, any of our partnerships, making sure that money is accountable, making sure that process and that bidding process is also accountable, and that residents are actually given an input, especially if they're going to be impacted in the short term by any new development.
Thank you. Secretary King?
Thank you. Look, the bridge portion of the project should absolutely happen. That is essential to make sure the bridge is safe. The toll road project is a disaster, a bad idea. It is the transportation policy of the 1950s brought forward. We don't need that. We actually need a modern transportation policy. What that would mean is investment in public transit. Certainly more frequent MARC trains would help. Certainly improved bus service would help. But we also may want to explore other ideas like reversible lanes. There are different approaches, but we don't need a toll road that's designed mostly to profit the private sector company. In essence, the P3 is really just a euphemism for privatization and steering resources to a private company. We really need to rethink the project, and we'll have the opportunity to do that when I'm governor. We also need to think about the intersections with housing policy, making sure that we are building more multifamily units, higher density near transit hubs. We also need to make sure that there's reliable broadband access throughout the state so that people can have flexible schedules and make different choices about the time at which they go to work. There's a much more ambitious and forward-looking approach than the one that has been taken by Governor Hogan and Comptroller Francho.
Thank you. County Executive Newman?
As it pertains to the American Legion Bridge, I think we should start thinking a little bit differently about how we're building out public transportation. We don't necessarily need another bridge. Why can't we go under the Potomac instead of over the Potomac? And, look, they built a tunnel underneath the English Channel. We can do it between Maryland and D.C. or Maryland and Virginia. The truth is that we are inextricably tied. D.C., Virginia, and Maryland are always going to be connected from an economic development standpoint. And we need to start thinking more creatively about how we expand public transportation between each of the jurisdictions. As far as the expanded toll lanes go, I feel very strongly that we are creating haves and have-nots when we have $20 tolls to go on a road that other people have to travel on to get back and forth to work, and they can't afford that toll. I really strongly object to that approach. There isn't any question that we're going to continue to build out the infrastructure. That will happen. This is a hub in the United States. The question is, how do we do it thoughtfully and responsibly? I think we do it through increased public transportation. And if we're not willing to look at how we're doing it here in the United States, why don't we look around the world? Because some of the most progressive cities have been successful in building out thoughtful infrastructure that supports the entire community. We need to make sure that we do it in relationship, in partnership with Washington, D.C. and Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Siegel?
When it comes to safety, yes, we'll invest in it. But we'll do absolutely nothing to accommodate the automobile. Our view is that the automobile actually has done more harm to mankind's ability to live the good life than any other invention in human history. Let me explain why. If you look at history from the long span, the basic fact of life across every culture is that almost all human labor, almost all human work was devoted to growing enough food to stay alive. Okay? What liberated mankind to do anything else was an enormous agricultural productivity revolution that only happened as recently as the last 200 years. So agriculture went, for instance, as recently as from 1900, from 50% of the household budget, which meant 2.5 days of work was designed for food, went down to 15%, which meant 3/4 of a day. That liberated a very significant chunk of the work week for people to devote their time to doing what really is meaningful in life, whatever that turns out to be, whether it's being with friends, family, religious study, service, whatever. The automobile came along and went from 0% of the household budget in 1900 to 20% today, an entire day. That is, it robbed the benefit that the agricultural revolution did in freeing mankind from somewhere close to 50% of the miracle that happened in agriculture.
Thank you. I think one of the hardest parts about moderating something like this is keeping track of the alphabetical order. So this question is about Frederick County. Frederick County is lacking in easily accessible public transportation, and many people here are interested in expanding MARC train service to the city. Right now, there are 3 trains in the morning and 3 trains at night, weekdays only. Do you have specific plans to boost commuter transportation services in the state?
Yeah, I mean, so building upon my previous answers, again, we need to look at the issue comprehensively. So where public transit is already accessible, making sure it's free to residents, making sure we are expanding MARC train services. And again, these issues are not only interconnected, but they're issues that I hear every single time I come to Frederick County. I have a mobile office where I'm in a different county consistently each and every day of the week. And I'm in Frederick County on the 4th, at the very least on the 4th of every month. And when I speak to residents who meet me during those office hours and when I'm canvassing, they do mention this idea of accessibility, making sure how do they actually get to and from where they need to go. And so we also need to look into ride-sharing opportunities like an Uber, like an Lyft, making sure we're providing folks with not only job opportunities, but getting more people to carpool and get off the roads and, again, get to and from places of work or anything else that they need to do. And then also making sure we're prioritizing the budget, to one of your earlier questions, so that we are not forgetting about certain counties that are not in the same, super voting districts or in the suburbs or in southern Maryland and Baltimore, Montgomery County, where I'm from. So I think that's my approach, and that's how I would handle the situation.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Yeah, I think additional MARC trains are essential, and I would also want to see significant investment in bus service so that we have buses that are frequent and reliable that come to the MARC stops. That's going to expand folks' access not only to the train to commute, but their access to retail, their access to medical care, their access to visit their grandchildren. We also need to invest in mobility services for folks with disabilities. One of the tragedies really in the state is that we've chronically underinvest in Mobility Link, and the result is for folks with disabilities, they're sometimes waiting 2-3 hours for the ride that they're supposed to get based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we have to see public transit as access to opportunity, access to quality of life, and make the investment that reflects that value. And we have the opportunity. We've got a multi-billion-dollar surplus. This is an opportunity to make that investment and to think about climate. So we make sure that our buses are electric buses so that we're not exacerbating our reliance on fossil fuels.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
I'm really glad that transportation is a big part of the conversation tonight because transportation is often overlooked. The truth is that when I was county executive in Anne Arundel County, it was such an important issue that I put together a commission to study it in the county. And what I found is that more people want more transportation. The biggest issue with it is that there are some people who don't want it in their backyard. So the question becomes, how do we find that balance? How do we increase public transportation at the same time hearing the needs of the community? That's where government comes in. That's our role. Our role is to be the broker and find a solution. When I also ran economic development in Howard County, same question. How do we increase transportation? I recently spoke with the leadership here in Frederick County, County Executive Jan Gardner. The same issue exists here in Frederick. It is across our state. We don't spend enough time talking about solutions. We need increased public transportation. And I can tell you, while a lot of people will say not in my backyard, the truth is it's the number one thing that comes up in a public forum in the community. Everybody wants increased access to transportation. The question is, who has the fortitude, who has the determination to make the tough decisions that balance that need for increased transportation with the folks in the community who don't want it in their backyard? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel?
So, yes, of course, we're going to expand public transportation. It's an important part of our strategy of trying to break automobile dependency. We really have two objectives. Either to make it possible that people can live better without a car than with a car, or at least better with one car rather than two. And secondly, to make it possible, if you do have a car, to do so with very little toll on the household budget. Okay, so those are the two challenges. In terms of making it possible to do without a car, mass transit is part of it, buses are part of it, but part of it is how do you get from the last stop on the commuter bus to work? And what we believe you should have is basically free, state-subsidized cabs, jitneys, that'll pick people up at the last stop and take them free to work. They won't have to deal with parking. They'll save money on parking. They won't have to be in a traffic jam. We'll cut down on congestion because people will be doing that. So that's one thing. In terms of the lower cost, if you do have a car, our focus is actually on the Wuling Mini, and I want to talk about that in this question and subsequently. The best-selling car EV in the world is the Tesla, which starts at $55,000. The Wuling Mini is the second best-selling car. It starts at $5,000.
Thank you. Mr. Barron.
Yes, thank you. So I do support increasing public transportation, including Mark, through the usual process of their environmental impact statements and all the rest. The thing that I would do very differently than the current process is this, and picking up on my last answer. When major infrastructure projects are undertaken or launched, there are incentives for the contractor, the proposer who bids on it, to underbid the project because they know the state is on the hook. And then when there are cost overruns, the taxpayer picks it up. That's what happened with the Purple Line. The Purple Line is over 4 years over budget and over $1 billion, 4 years over time and over $1 billion over budget because one of the major the main contractors, Fluor, a Texas-based company, had a long track record of doing this. That should have been seen in the procurement process. The way to make sure that each of these projects comes in on time and within budget is not just to look at what they put on a piece of paper in their proposal, because you can put anything on a piece of paper. I know this. This was my experience at running a major procurement program at the Department of Defense. The key and the most important piece is to look at past performance and to hire a team that has been reliable. That's how we hire, you hire contractors in our house. It's how for personal services, and also it's how the government should operate.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler?
Thank you. I've been coming to Frederick for 50 years. In the last year, I've been coming about once a week. I haven't been here since Sunday this week, and I love this city. I find it reprehensible that it's the biggest city in America that does not have a hotel in its downtown region. So when I'm governor, one of the very first things I'm going to do is to work with the mayor, work with the alder people of Frederick City, and make sure we build the conference center downtown. It's smart growth. It's where it ought to be. We need to have parking. We can't have the city rimmed with hotels and businesses. We need to build from the center. The Riverwalk is beautiful. It's a wonderful area of the city, and we need to make sure we have that conference center. But we need to make sure Frederick stays safe. I've been a prosecutor for 22 years. I've been ahead on criminal justice reform, starting when I was the head of the NAACP in Montgomery County in 1989. Setting up the first domestic violence dockets, drug courts, family justice center. We need to make sure Frederick stays safe so that people want to use transportation, public transportation, to get here. And we need to have a candidate that can win. We need to win the general election. This is the most democratic state in the country. We're 2.5 to 1 Democrat, and we need to make sure that Michael Huff does not become the county executive. Whether it's Darrell, whether it's Jessica, whether it's Kai, we need to make sure we have a top of the ticket where we don't have to run away from, like the last election where we lost by the biggest margin of any Democrat in the history of Maryland.
Thank you. On the next question, we're going to start with Secretary King. The Red Line Light Rail project, which was proposed to run east-west across Baltimore, was scuttled early during the administration of Governor Hogan. Recent congressional efforts have helped put the project back on track. Would you give the Red Line a high priority for funding in your administration? And if so, would you be prepared to provide a dedicated funding source for that project alongside federal funding?
Absolutely. Look, the governor's decision to cancel the Red Line project was dog whistle politics, plain and simple. He called it a boondoggle and suggested that we shouldn't spend money on those people. That was what the governor was saying. And that was a tragic mistake. It set the city's economic development back 20, 30, maybe 40 years and hurt the state. At the end of the day, the success of Maryland is bound up with the success of Baltimore. And so we, of course, need to build the Red Line. One of the great things about the design of the Red Line project was intentionality about mixed-use development at each of the stops, which would have helped spur economic development in the neighborhoods of Baltimore. We absolutely have to pursue that project. Alongside it, we have to pursue the MARC train expansion west and the increase number of MARC trains. We've got to do the Southern Maryland Light Rail project. We have to have a vision that centers people at the end of the day. And it was a tragic mistake that the governor made. I'm grateful that Senator Cardin and Senator Van Hollen have put us in a position to correct that mistake going forward.
Thank you. County Executive Newman.
My response to the canceling of the Red Line was honestly shock. I really did think that the governor was going to take some serious heat for it. I was shocked and surprised that he was able to make that decision without more pushback from not only from the community, but across the state. I grew up in Baltimore City. I am the only candidate in this race born and raised in Baltimore City, also educated in Baltimore City. I grew up on mass transit buses, going to school, going to the library, and going to work. And the truth is that if we had the Red Line or we had other forms of transportation besides just the bus service, Baltimore would be a different city today. Baltimore is suffering from a lack of investment, a lack of leadership, a lack of vision. And that starts at the top. It starts with the governor. I was disappointed to see his decision, but I'm also shocked that the city is accepting this from the governor that we have in Annapolis. We need new leadership that believes in the city and has a close relationship with the city. Until we have a governor that understands the needs of Baltimore, Baltimore cannot succeed. So I feel really impassioned about this, and I'm talking about this in Frederick County, but that's because it's personal for me. I have lived this personally. And I know you guys care about transportation here, and it is just as important here in Frederick. I was on Mountain Mamas recently in Garrett County, and they were talking about the importance of transportation there. Baltimore City, though, cannot succeed without support from Annapolis, and we need a governor who wants that relationship and wants to make a difference there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Siegel?
So in answer to the specifics of your question, yes and yes, we will definitely support the Red Line. And we will definitely have dedicated funding for it. Let me go back to where I left off before about the Wuling Mini, okay? So the Tesla is the best-selling electric vehicle in the world. If you can find one these days, it starts for somewhere, let's say, $57,000. Biden has a gigantic refundable credit for the purchase of electric vehicles in the Build Back Better. We don't know if it's going to get through Congress. It may not. A lot depends on Joe Manchin. If it does, you'll be able to take that credit actually at the point of purchase. So you want to buy a Tesla, you can actually get your credit right then and there, and they'll sell it to you for $7,000 off, maybe even $12,000 off if it's built in the United States. So if you're doing very well, not bad, you get to buy a $50,000 Tesla. Doesn't mean anything to people who work for minimum wage. Doesn't mean anything for half of our country. What it means is that the way electric vehicles are going to reach low-income people is that they're going to be there when they become old used cars, okay? The Wuling Mini is the opposite. The Wuling Mini will be part of our strategy to focus at people at the bottom and have a near-free electric vehicle, the near-free EV. So low-income people are going to be the first ones to be driving electric vehicles.
Thank you. Mr. Barron.
Yes, so I strongly support an effective east-west transit solution in Baltimore, which is very likely the Red Line. The let me explain that in a moment. I was very proud of our congressional delegation for getting the red line pushed to the top of the assessed priority list. And as that process goes forward, the environmental impact statement and all the rest, it seems likely that the red line will be the solution. And I would support dedicated funding for that. But the bottom line is I would support funding, including the federal funding and dedicated state funding for an effective east-west solution in Baltimore. It is essential for economic development and for quality of life. Let me talk about one other very important issue for quality of life. Nobody likes sitting in traffic. Nobody likes sitting at the bus stop. I mean, I've done that when in Montgomery County, Maryland, the buses are reasonably reliable, but that means about 80% of the time. A lot of people, you can't be late to work. I had flexibility in my job, so I continued to ride the bus. In Baltimore, it's about 70% of reliability. That is totally unacceptable. It's just not a viable system. So what is needed is to put in place transportation officials and a quality assurance structure to make sure we get up to 95% reliability in the buses. That could also include infrastructure changes like dedicated bus lanes and traffic lights that prioritize transit vehicles, but getting reliability up is essential.
Thank you. Attorney General Gansler.
We need a full commitment to mass transit. We need to put the subway, the WMATA Metro over the Wilson Bridge for which it was built. We need to make sure we have the Southern Branch light rail to Charles County. We need to make sure we actually finish the Purple Line and do it at cost. And we need to make sure we expand, have mass transit from Shady Grove to Frederick. So we need that. We clearly need the red line. When Governor Hogan scrapped the red line, that was like taking a sledgehammer to the people of Baltimore City. Baltimore is the biggest city in Maryland. It has almost 400 murders a year if they were counted appropriately. Businesses can't open. People won't go downtown because they're afraid of getting knocked over their head at lunch for their iPhones. We need to have somebody who understands how to make the streets safe. Look, I was a prosecutor for 22 years, state, federal, and local. If you want this state to be safe, I would ask for your vote. If you don't want it to be safe, you should vote for somebody else. It's going to be that simple. And so when we talk about Baltimore and transit, we also have to recognize that 1/3 of the people in Baltimore City don't have cars. So they can't get to work if there's no red line, if there's no mass transit. So we need to make a full commitment to it. And we have the money right now that we've never had before to commit to mass transit.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
Yeah, so to the question on the red line, my campaign and I shared a comprehensive transportation and infrastructure policy memo on our website, janeforgovernor.com, since last January of 2021. And in that, we do talk about fully funding and support for the red line. It is a climate issue because obviously the more folks that have access to mass transit, it's going to help our environment. It's an economic issue because the state spent over $300 million in plans for the red line. We forfeited almost $900 million of federal funding, so it hurts our economy. And also, it was a plan that would have connected isolated black neighborhoods to commerce and to anything else that they need to do. So it is also a racial issue. So my commitment to the red line is full, but again, it is also looking at the issue comprehensively, like I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. On this next question, we're going to start with Laura Newman, and we're going to go to your former backyard. Or current, I don't know. The Bay Bridge is very old. What are your solutions to the congestion issues in that part of our state? And do you think there should be additional bridges built to accommodate different Eastern Shore locations instead of routing all cars over the Bay Bridge?
Well, you're actually more in my backyard than you realize. I was the county executive for Anne Arundel County, which is the county you must pass through to go over the Bay Bridge to get to the Eastern Shore. But I also own a house in Somerset County, the poorest county in the state of Maryland. And, that community is pretty isolated. We talk a lot about the Bay Bridge from Anne Arundel to Queen Anne's, but we don't talk enough about southern Maryland to the southern tip of Maryland. If we had a bridge between southern Maryland and somewhere else on the Eastern Shore, we would be alleviating traffic. Not only would we be alleviating traffic, we would also be rerouting people from Washington, D.C. So I think we need to think creatively. If we're going to build another bridge, we might want to think, it's been discussed before, it's been considered. I don't understand why we can't consider again a bridge from St. Mary's to Chrisfield. If we want all of our state to be prosperous, let's stop focusing on just a few key areas and let's focus on the whole state. Chrisfield is the poorest, Somerset County is the poorest county in the state of Maryland. They would benefit from economic development. And if we were able to offload some of that traffic, all we're doing is improving that community. So my belief is that, yes, we need increased options, absolutely. But maybe we need to think outside the box and come up with some more creative solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel?
So, no, we don't favor investments in car infrastructure in order to deal with congestion. Essentially, we don't believe in accommodating the car. We believe in shrinking the role of the car. There are other ways of dealing with congestion, some of them very powerful. First of all, what we're about, more than anything else, as I said before, is time. We want to put time back on the American agenda. It was central. We went for labor struggles in the 19th century, 60-hour week, 50-hour week, 40-hour week. That was part of what people struggled for in addition to more money. And then we stopped. Almost a century ago, we got the 40-hour week and we didn't do anything beyond that. And then what happened is that when women entered the formal labor force, from the household point of view, it went from 40 hours to 50 hours to 60 hours, some two-parent households, 80 hours of adults being outside of the household. So we have a time famine in America. And I'll talk about why time is so central to a changed culture. So to deal with congestion, the 4-day week, first of all, will mean that it'll only be 80% of the cars on the road any given day. Secondly, we will promote what we started in the pandemic, which is working from home. So we'll cut down congestion that way. And third, as I mentioned before, the idea of free taxi service at the last stop of commuter buses is going to make it possible for people to abandon cars.
Thank you. Mr. Barron?
So I think my answer about a new Bay Bridge or an additional Bay Bridge and so on is that we don't yet know because things have changed recently. The toll booths on the Bay Bridge were eliminated. We've had reduced traffic due to COVID, due to the pandemic. And we don't know whether that's temporary or how much of that may be more long-term as there's more remote work, so less commuting. So I do support studies going forward, the currently planned studies about the Bay Bridge and the different options, whether there should be a third span or some other option. But we also need to see how things shake out over time once we get past the pandemic and what happens to traffic patterns. I would also say this more generally. I strongly support the push to clean. I have nothing against cars and automobiles, as long as they are clean. And as we are moving toward hybrid and electric vehicles and other clean vehicles. I recently announced a comprehensive climate policy that that would make the following steps in that direction, major steps. We are as part of a regional initiative called RGGI that reduces power plant emissions. We partner with 11 other states. That applies to power plants. It's been very effective. It's reduced power plant emissions by over 47% over the past 10 years. One of my main initiatives would be to expand that to transportation. I can talk about more about that later, but that will incentivize and provide the funds for electric cars and clean vehicles.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler?
Yeah, we have a lot of money right now for infrastructure, and we need to focus on mass transit. I would say the Bay Bridge would be very, 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 very low priority in getting a new Bay Bridge, another span. We could look at that way down the road. There's so many other needs. The problem I see with it immediately is I'm an environmentalist. I have the most comprehensive by far, as your publication noted, called Green Maryland regarding the environment. and you can find it on our website, doughansler.com. And a part of what it talks about is preventing sprawl. And we don't need more houses. For example, there's a project called Lakeside in Trapp, Maryland on the Eastern Shore, 2,600 new houses, totally unneeded, totally in defiance of smart growth. And so we don't need to build another bridge to get more people to go to the Eastern Shore. In fact, one of the first things I want to do when I'm Attorney General, after helping get the conference center in downtown Frederick, is to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure into a power source, a clean power source on the Eastern Shore, so that chicken manure no longer goes into the bay. When I was Attorney General, I was known as the Environmental Attorney General by my peers because we took on corporate polluters. We joined RGGI. We had the biggest asbestos settlement in Maryland's history. We had the biggest air pollution settlement in American history. We went after polluters of mercury in West Virginia that was coming over here. So we need to make sure we have offshore wind off Ocean City. We need to have solar power on the Eastern Shore, public, residential, and private. And we need to make sure we preserve the Eastern Shore, not build a new bridge over to it.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
So as it relates to the Bay Bridge, which was your question, as I stated earlier, I do support environmental impact studies be mandated and required for any piece of legislation or proposal that could impact the environment. And based on the environmental impact studies that were done for that area, the study showed that a singular Bay Bridge with around 8 lanes or so would be the least impact to the environment. And so that is the proposal that I do support. I would, however, make sure that at least 1 or 2 of those new lanes would be designated for HOV and or bus lanes. And we do not forget about investing in the access roads on both ends of the bridge, which often gets overlooked whenever you're building these new infrastructure projects. Because at the end of the day, even though, as I mentioned earlier as well, building more roads, building more lanes does not necessarily reduce traffic in the long term because demand increases. When you talk to residents on the Eastern Shore, businesses on the Eastern Shore, there's an immediate need to not only reduce traffic, but also encourage more economic development, again, in a sustainable and smart manner. So that's the proposal that I would support.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Thanks. I certainly would prioritize all of the public transportation projects that we've been talking about tonight first. But I think there's value in a study to look at, are there better ways to connect to the Eastern Shore, to look at the possibility of an additional bridge. But that is down the road after we've focused on the transportation, the public transportation projects that we've been talking about. But I also think we need to think about economic development on the Eastern Shore. What are the things that would make it possible for the Eastern Shore communities to have greater economic opportunity? A few of the things we need: broadband access everywhere. That will also help to address some of the traffic issues. We need to make sure that there are healthcare providers in Eastern Shore communities, as well as Western Maryland and Southern Maryland communities, that too often can't access healthcare, and folks end up having to drive 2 hours to get to healthcare specialists. We need to incentivize healthcare providers to locate in rural communities. We need to invest in Main Street development, downtown development. Think about the model that Salisbury has been around using the arts as a strategy to boost Main Street development. And we have the opportunity to do mixed-use multifamily housing projects in those downtowns. That will create more economic opportunity on the Eastern Shore, which is vital to the state's long-term prosperity.
Thank you. The last question from me will go to Dr. Siegel first. The $1 trillion federal infrastructure bill that passed last year sets aside $1 billion for states to revisit historic infrastructure projects that divided and harmed communities, mostly communities of color. The Highway to Nowhere in Baltimore is frequently held up as an example of this type of project and the need for restorative policies. Can you say how you would spend the money that is coming to Maryland for these types of restorative purposes? And can you name any projects in addition to the Highway to Nowhere that you might also support?
I believe in restorative projects, and I believe in it much more than that. I think this country is going through what I would call the second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening was in the 1730s and 40s, and it was a return to the earlier religious emphasis of the Puritans in a society that increasingly was become commercialized. The Great Awakening that we're having now is made fun of by the right in terms of being woke. If you listen to DeSantis, governor of Florida, right? He talks about wokeism, and he talks about the vicious ideology of wokeism being part of what he calls cultural Marxism. Well, actually, I'm a cultural Marxist, and I'm proud of it. And if you haven't read the early Marx, you don't know what I'm talking about. And it's one of the problems. But I'm also reading the 1619 Project. And I started out, I didn't like that book in the first chapter. And it has just knocked me over. I'm only a third of the way through. And so, yeah, my whole consciousness of race in American society has been transformed. And I think we should be teaching some form of 1619 in every grade in Maryland.
Thank you. Mr. Barron?
So I was very pleased that the federal infrastructure bill that passed provides substantial funding for restorative projects. Highway to Nowhere is, one salient example. I would set up for much of the infrastructure spending, not just in this area but others, a competitive process where projects are reviewed by experts to determine which are most meritorious based on two main criteria. One is the need of the community. For example, is it a low-income community? Is this, like the Highway to Nowhere, has it been extremely disruptive and discriminatory? And number two is the merit of the project, whether it's a well-thought-out project that is actually going to solve the problem. That is the kind of approach I would set up for almost all of the money that comes in through the infrastructure bill, including environmental resilience projects to guard against the effects of climate change. There are parts of the Eastern Shore that really are on the front lines of climate change. Large sections of Dorchester County, for instance, are projected to be underwater within a few years. Again, we need a process in place based on experts to determine which are the highest need areas, and number two, which are the most valid projects, and make decisions on that basis.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler?
When I was Attorney General, I started the first Civil Rights Department in Maryland's history and focused on making sure that all people in Maryland had access to opportunity, equal access to opportunity, whether it's housing, transportation, public health, education, jobs, or criminal justice. And I'll take that to the governor's chair as well. When I was president of all the attorneys general of the United States, we had the national mortgage foreclosure crisis. We took on the big banks. We didn't let them push us around. We kept tens of thousands of Marylanders away from being evicted and foreclosed upon by the big banks, and that helped the economy and helped people in underserved communities. When the Frederick NAACP came to me when I was Attorney General about a young man who had been killed by the police by use of a taser, we started a task force. We put together a policy on the use of tasers that we disseminated throughout the United States to all the attorneys general. We haven't heard any issues with tasers in Maryland since then. We need to make sure we have transit-oriented affordable housing so that we don't have to, so people that are in rougher neighborhoods, that's one of the 3 MARC trains coming by. So people who are in underserved communities have access to affordable housing and mass transit so they can get to a job, get their kids to school. We need to make sure we have universal pre-K, universal child care so people can work and make sure that they have access to that. And we need to make sure that we have an education system that benefits everybody regardless of where they're from and what zip code they live in.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
So when it comes to infrastructure spending, whether it's from the federal government or even from the state, we have to build upon some of those projects I mentioned earlier, looking at the issue comprehensively. The Purple Line, finishing the Red Line, making sure we have the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit Project, making sure we're sustainably expanding the Bay Bridge, making sure we have free public transit for every resident, making sure that we're expanding MARC train services. All that is money that can be used, especially now that we have a budget surplus within the state, But what I would say beyond that is making sure that we are held accountable, that leaders are held accountable. So that, for example, when we voted for slots in 2007 and were promised that the revenue from the casinos would actually go to public schools, actually goes to public schools. That was not the case. So anytime we have a governor or an administration or any elected official, candidly, that makes promises, whether it's revenue streams that were already there, new revenue streams, a surplus, you name it, making sure that we hold them accountable. And that's where, at least in my administration, you can guarantee that I will be held accountable and fully accessible because of the way in which we're operating our campaign right now.
Thank you, Mr. King.
You know, we have to situate the things like the highway to nowhere in context, a context in Maryland that is a history that goes back to the institution of slavery. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. That history of slavery was followed by the history of segregation, followed by the history of redlining. That has shaped the decision to create projects like the Highway to Nowhere. It has shaped the decision to cancel projects like the Red Line, and it has shaped our current transportation landscape. You know, in the city of Baltimore, they had last year, in a single year, more than 300,000 instances of students being late to their first period class. And disproportionately, that was caused by the unreliable bus service that is the day-to-day reality for kids in Baltimore, where the bus doesn't come, where the bus is very late. And so they end up late to school, and it undermines their educational success. That is the consequence of transportation racism and how it plays out. So as we think about the use of infrastructure dollars, of course, we need to remediate specific examples of projects that were misguided, but we have to more broadly tackle all of the inequities that are rampant throughout our public transportation system.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
You know, I have had the opportunity to see every corner of the state of Maryland. I was born and raised in Maryland. I've seen the very best and the very worst of what this state has to offer. I grew up in inner city Baltimore. I live in Baltimore County. I ran economic development in Howard County. I was county executive in Anne Arundel County, and I have a home in Somerset County. If that didn't cover enough of the state, I was also in leadership Maryland and spent a tremendous amount of time here in the western part of Maryland and also in southern Maryland. If you could go to any corner of this state and find an area where there's need for investment, there's been disinvestment in so many of the communities across this state, and we only talk about the largest jurisdictions. They're important. I'm with you. They're important. There's a real concentration of need there. But a great example is your neighbor in Allegheny County. They had a paper mill there that closed down without a plan for what they were going to do about those jobs or what kind of economic development project would follow the closing of that mill. If you go to Baltimore City, there's been disinvestment in beautiful historic row homes in Baltimore City. If you go to Crisfield in Somerset County, you'll find that the biggest, most exciting project to happen in that community in a dozen years is a new public library, paid for with federal dollars, federal investment. They just put in a bike trail, transforming that small community into a place where people want to be. Let's do that across our state. It goes from one corner to the next, and if we really have an interest in making change in our communities, let's start there.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So now we're going to start with the exciting part and the hard part. So we have our questions from the audience. So this is your chance to win over a vote or 2 or 10 by answering their questions specifically, but you're only going to have 1 minute to do it. That's the hard part. So our first question is going to go back to the start of the alphabet, Mr. Barron. And that question is, we have a hand dryer and a train, so we're just going to wait a minute.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's going to stop, so we're going to go ahead and get started. What policies are you proposing to increase Maryland's business footprint through improving access to transportation?
So I've talked about some of my transportation proposals this evening in terms of the Beltway and all the rest, mass transit. But I want to take a step back and Infrastructure and transportation is important to economic and business development, but there's a factor that is much more important, which is people. Studies show that the quality, the education, the training of the workforce is the single most important factor in the success of any state or jurisdiction. It's more important than infrastructure, actually. It's more important than the tax code and all the rest. People matter. The quality of the workforce matters. It really matters to business and economic success. That's why my top priority when I become governor will be to launch a public-private partnership with businesses across the state to provide effective job training to every young adult in the state of Maryland who wants to advance. Studies show that if it's done right, it can increase earnings of young adults by as much as 40%. I want to do this statewide.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler.
Yeah, we need to make sure we have the Southern Maryland Light Rail. We need to make sure we build the Red Line. We need to make sure we have a grown-up overseeing the Purple Line. We need to reduce, have a commuter toll on the ICC, whether we like it or not. It's sitting there. It's completely underutilized. And we need to make sure that if you're somebody who commutes on the ICC, you can pay a reduced fare. We need to make sure we have bus service, enhanced bus service in Western Maryland and Southern Maryland and on the shore, make sure those buses are electric. So we need to make sure we actually, Democrats spend a lot of time talking about employees and workers, and we need to do that, but we need to make sure we have small businesses and prop up our minority-owned businesses, our women-owned businesses, to make sure that there are actually jobs there for people to go to. I'll use a couple extra seconds to talk about reentering citizens. We need to make sure that we provide opportunities for those coming out of jail, to give tax breaks to companies that hire them, and to give them training while they're actually incarcerated, about to come out of jail.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
So I come from a minority-owned small business family. My mother, who's actually in the audience, started a small business with my father, despite the language barriers, despite the cultural barriers, and they decided to move and start their business and their family in Maryland because of this idea of diversity, of inclusion, but also because we were looking at communities that had infrastructure, that had good schools and education. And so as a candidate for governor, and as hopefully your next governor, that's where my comprehensive small business platform will help spur more economic development in our state. We talked about the transportation infrastructure projects earlier, but I also want to make sure that we are investing in my Maryland Now plan, which one part will make public transit completely free. It will also eliminate the state income tax for 95% of Maryland workers, anyone who makes less than $400,000, create the nation's first guaranteed jobs program, and really making sure that, again, we're including and bringing residents to the table. So we're investing in both employers and employees, keeping people in Maryland and bringing new people into Maryland as well.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Yeah, there's no question that transportation policy and economic development policy intersect. As we build the Southern Maryland Light Rail project, as we finish the Purple Line, as we build the Red Line, those are all opportunities to create mixed-use development at the transit hubs, an opportunity to build retail, an opportunity to build housing. We'll need the state to be a partner in those projects. One of the ways the state could do that is to create a state bank. Today, only North Dakota has a state bank. What happens is the state bank holds the state assets and then partners with community banks to provide loans to small businesses that are starting and growing in the state. That's an opportunity we have in Maryland to grow good jobs here. We also have an opportunity through smart climate strategies to build the future green economy that we need. We have an opportunity through solar, through wind, to provide the power for our homes and for our cars as we build 10,000 charging stations and shift over to electric vehicles.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
Transit-oriented development. It is the perfect intersection of government and business. You know, a lot of times government and business can't get along too well. They don't always agree. The goal's not always the same. The investment isn't always the same. Well, there's one area where government and business are very much aligned, and we have a great example of it succeeding in Prince George's County. If you have transit-oriented development, meaning you're providing public transportation, I promise you developers want to be there. So, you know, it's really hard sometimes to understand the motives of the developer. If you're in government, they're business people. They're going to go where the opportunity exists. If we do more transit-oriented development, that is the hottest real estate, the hottest property in any community. It's been successful across the state, and that's where the investment needs to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel?
So I don't believe in accepting the business community in its own terms and trying to figure out how to lure them to Maryland or how to get them to invest. I actually think that the maximization of profits for shareholder model of social organization is responsible for pollution. It's what economists call an externality. It's a cost in production that they didn't have to bear because they could just dump it into the commons and have destroyed it or have come near destroying it for all of us. The most amazing thing to happen is this year was the Business Roundtable, the largest corporations in America, put out a statement saying that maximization of profits is no longer an acceptable bottom line. The question for us is how to institutionalize that. I believe in establishing a new kind of corporation, somewhere between a nonprofit and the old profit maximization called value corporations, V corporations, and we can start here in Maryland.
Thank you. And our second audience question for the night is going to go to Mr. Gansler first. So we're going farther west in Maryland for this. So some rural communities, such as Garrett County, have no regular public transportation, making it a challenge for those without cars to go to work. On top of that, our high schools are no longer offering driver's education, making it very difficult for young people to get a license. What would your solution be for such a rural Maryland community?
Well, so there's five counties in Maryland: Garrett, Allegheny, Washington, Frederick, and Carroll. And as governor, Democrats often say, we're going to be governor for all of Maryland, and then they visit Western Maryland once, they never come back. I'm always in Western Maryland. I'm in all five counties all the time. I'll be in Carroll County this weekend. And so I think it's critical for us to actually care about those counties. Garrett County is interesting because it gets Pittsburgh television. They literally don't know they don't hear from us every day, but we need to recognize that Garrett and Allegheny and Washington in particular, the sort of western Maryland counties, do need transportation. They do need enhanced bus systems, and that's how people can get to and from work. And we need to actually get jobs out there. If you look at Cumberland, what a great city before it lost Pittsburgh Paint and all the different companies, Mack Truck, that left. There's Volvo still there, but we need to bring more industry back to Maryland. We need to have PLAs as well to build some of the new infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. Jane?
So as I mentioned earlier, through my mobile offices, I'm in a different county consistently and personally every single day. I'm in Garrett County on the 1st of every single month, Allegheny on the 2nd, Washington on the 3rd, and so forth. And obviously, public transit right now is not feasible, especially in the short term. It's just not feasible. And so one of the solutions that we came up with the team and residents who actually live in these counties who are going to be impacted by these decisions is making sure we're encouraging more ride-sharing opportunities, making sure that an Uber and Lyft, companies like that, are able to operate. It will help provide short-term income to those residents who live in those areas, and making sure that we get more people off the roads, commuting together. I think that's a really sustainable short-term way. But long-term, we have to look at all these other infrastructure projects that I was building upon earlier in order to really reduce traffic, really reduce congestion, help our environment, help our economy as well for every resident.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Look, we have to make sure that kids have access to driver's ed so that, because sadly, in many parts of the state, driving is still going to be the core form of transportation. That said, there's much more we can do to create alternatives. So that there's ride sharing, there's investment in public buses, there's investment in protected bike paths, there's creating more walkable communities, there's growing the downtowns with multifamily housing units that make it easier for people to live near downtown. You know, Cumberland has an ambitious plan for redevelopment of their main street and development of a waterfront park that may attract business and housing to downtown. Hagerstown has a plan to move the baseball stadium to the downtown. That will also create an opportunity to draw business and housing to the downtown. So we can make communities that are more people-centric rather than car-centric, but that's got to be the long-term goal.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
I was recently on Mountain Maryland Mamas, and it's a podcast for moms talking about issues in Garrett County. And it'll air on March 22nd with Maureen and Jessica. Thank you for having me on. We covered a lot of subjects in that conversation. But the one that came up over and over again, and honestly, the one that comes up over and over again across the state, whether it's an urban area or a suburban area or, in the far reaches of our state, it's always transportation. The issue is the same. The solution is different. And so, look, I'm going to tell you, when I was county executive in Anne Arundel, number one most popular service we provided was transportation for seniors. I never went to a public forum, without discussion about it. Everyone cares about transportation, and it's equally important in Garrett County as it is in Baltimore City. We need to make transportation accessible. It's how we level the playing field and make sure everyone has an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel? Yes, no, it's been a while. So the question was about a lack of transportation in Garrett County, and on top of that, the high school is not offering driver's education, so it makes it difficult for young people to get around. What solution would you offer?
All right. Well, it brings me back to the Wuling Mini. We're going to provide near-free electric vehicles to the people of Garrett. Okay, by near-free, I mean under $3,000 for a brand new electric vehicle. The key to that is the Wuling Mini or something like it. And I'll tell you two things. The Wuling Mini is the second best-selling electric vehicle in the world. Right? Tesla is the first. Tesla is 57,000. The Wuling Mini is 5,000. The Wuling Mini is only available in China. But you know what's really interesting about the Wuling Mini? It's made by a company that General Motors owns 44% of. General Motors essentially is making $5,000 electric vehicles in China, but not for the United States. Why is that? It's because General Motors makes its decision about what to make for the United States based on the profit maximization point. And the profit maximization point is not for a $5,000 car, okay? I think that Maryland should have benchmark corporations. If we're going to not have low-cost electric vehicles here with Detroit, then we should go into business ourselves.
Thank you.
Set up a State of Maryland car company, and then turn it over to nonprofit management once it gets going.
Thank you. Mr. Barron.
Yes, there are two developments that bode very well for economic development in Western Maryland and other more rural parts of the state. One is the expansion of broadband, including through funding from the infrastructure bill and from the state. That's moving in the right direction. And also the possibility for remote work. The pandemic has awakened people to the fact that you can live in a more rural area and work remotely and potentially commute into Frederick or to Baltimore one day a week. So that is increasingly possible. But we need to create well-paying jobs for people to fill, even if they're done remotely. That's why I am launching, when I'm governor, this public-private partnership for effective job training. It needs to be focused. The keys to getting real effectiveness are, number one, focus that training on fast-growing industries like IT and healthcare, and number two, to work hand-in-hand with employers to provide paid internships to the state, to the employees, to the trainees. So under my plan, the state will pay for the training, the businesses pay for the internships, our economy, including Western Maryland, gets skilled workers, everybody benefits.
Thank you. And that ends the audience portion. Thank you guys for your questions. I have not yet had the honor to have any of you knock on my front door, so we're going to give you the chance to do some closing arguments, and I want to hear your tight 60-second stoop pitch. And keeping with the alphabetical order, we're going to start with Mr. Jain.
Well, thank you all so much again for this opportunity. My name is Ashwani Jain, and I'm running for governor to make our politics inclusive and accessible. That's why, unlike other candidates, I am fully accessible because 100% of our events are free, and through my mobile offices, I am personally meeting voters in a different county every day of the week. I am fully accountable because 100% of our campaign is run by residents from every age, background, and county. I'm fully transparent because we've shared the most detailed and comprehensive policy agenda since last January 2021, made by residents, not consultants. And unlike other candidates and other campaigns, We have proven that we can build a winning campaign with the most volunteers from each of our counties without needing to constantly fundraise. You can go to janeforgovernor.com to reach out to me to learn more about my policies or my background, and I do appreciate this opportunity again. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. King?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation tonight. I hope what folks have seen is how deeply interconnected transportation policy is with housing policy, with economic development, with issues of equity, and with our strategy as a state to tackle climate action. And we've put forward at johnkingforgovernor.com an incredibly ambitious plan around the investment we need to make in transportation and the vision for getting Maryland to be one of the first states to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And sometimes people tell me, well, that plan seems like a long shot because it's so ambitious and so challenging to get to that more just and prosperous future. And I say to them, my whole life has been a long shot. When I was a kid, my mom passed away when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The thing that saved me was public school. It's a miracle that I'm sitting here, a miracle that I had the opportunity to be a teacher and principal and secretary of education for President Obama. I believe in long shots, and I believe together we can build that more just future in Maryland.
Thank you. Ms. Newman?
I've seen the very best and the very worst of what Maryland has to offer. You know, I've had the honor of serving as a county executive. I've been in public service for a long time, but that's not where I started. I grew up in inner city Baltimore. Both of my parents were high school dropouts. They both have arrest records. I followed in their footsteps and became a high school dropout myself. I chose to live out of my car for 6 months rather than pee at home because I couldn't wait to leave because it was so dysfunctional and so abusive. I saved enough money while I was living out of my car to pay my first down payment on an apartment when I was 18. I moved into that apartment, and 2 weeks later, I was raped at gunpoint. The police never investigated. They didn't believe me. In fact, they told me they didn't believe me. Despite that, I went on to get a master's degree in business without finishing high school or college. I started as a customer service rep, but then I became a tech entrepreneur. My company was eventually sold for $230 million. And after 19 years, I went back and had the police investigate my rape case, and it was solved in 3 days. I'll bring that same determination to running the state of Maryland. Thank you. LauraNewman.com.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel?
So I spent 20 years in University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and I was there in 2 institutes. One of them dealt with foreign policy, one of them dealt with philosophy and public policy. In the second one, I wrote a book called Graceful Simplicity, which was really the basis for Bread and Roses and Bread and Roses Socialism. In the other one, I wrote a book called Negotiating Jerusalem. And it reflected something broader, which is that I've spent 40 years, working on conflict resolution, primarily the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often at a very high level. One of the things that I was proud of was that the research that I did on this book, Negotiating, oh my God, I thought I got a minute and a half. This is crazy. All right, I gave out a handout. It's out front. It's called the Camp David Initiative. It has to do with Frederick County, Frederick City. I spent an hour with Mayor O'Connor discussing it today. It's going to make Camp David something that's live for the people here, not just affect things economically, but the meaning of what it is to come from Frederick and put Frederick on the map.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barron?
Maryland is a great state, but I jumped into this race because we are not making progress on major problems that damage the lives of millions, and I'm offering a fundamentally different approach. In education, for instance, more than a quarter of middle school students in Maryland can't read at a basic level. Those and other achievement numbers are no different than they were 20 years ago. More than 500,000 Marylanders live below the poverty line, and we've made zero progress reducing the state's poverty rate in more than 30 years. Low and moderate income Marylanders have seen stagnant wages since the 1980s as income inequality has soared. Our state can't just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for decades, rolling out one unproven government program after another and expect a different result, because many programs just don't work. That's why we have to expand programs that have been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. That's the difference, tested and proven. Like the proven effective job training program that I outlined. I've also outlined a statewide tutoring corps for students in the early grades, first and second graders who are struggling. All of them should get high quality tutoring that's proven to work, and I have other examples.
Thank you. Mr. Gansler.
I want to thank the other 5 candidates who thought it was important enough tonight to come to Western Maryland and be part of the Democratic Party. I think that's really important. We need to have, Western Maryland has got to be part of the equation. It's the only way in which we can get the governor's chair back. The 5 candidates up here have had wonderful careers in their walks of life. None of them have ever been elected to anything ever. I think experience matters. In 23 years of government, the reason why that's important is not just because somebody sat around in government, but it's because they understand how the levers of government work to get things done. When I was state's attorney in Montgomery County, a county of over 1 million people, we counted our murders in the teens every year. We have brought down violent crime everywhere we've gone. I led the fight for marriage equality at the statewide level here, for which I was impeached by the Republicans in Annapolis. We need to make sure that we have somebody who can actually win in this fall election, so we do not end up with Michael Huff as the county executive of Frederick County.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We are delighted. I'd like to say thank you to our candidates who are with us this evening. There will be other Burger and Brew forums. I'd like to thank our moderator, Danielle Gaines. Danielle has done this with us before, and you were fantastic again tonight. We are so grateful to you. Thank you for doing this. We hope everyone learned more about this group of candidates. We'd like to thank Attaboy for hosting us tonight. Thank you, Frederick, for making us feel so welcome here. I love coming here, and tonight was not a disappointment. Thank you to our viewers for joining us tonight, our sponsors who are sponsoring all of these Burger and Brew forums. Thank you to all of you that are here tonight. Our next forum will be in Salisbury on the 14th of April. Please follow us on social media for more information. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.